Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and I'm not gonna lie, I too would be pretty distraught to be one episode away from the finale of my favourite show, only for a cyber attack to usher in the downfall of all civilization. I mean, there's no good time for the digital apocalypse to bring society to its knees, but right when you're about to find out whether Ross and Rachel finally got together, the timing of that just seems cruel. These are all, of course, allusions to the fantastic Leave the World Behind, a new Netflix disaster movie written and directed by my guest today, the tremendously talented Sam Esmail. Leave the World Behind deals with themes that Sam himself has found impossible to leave behind in the 8 years since creating Mr. Robot, the techno-thriller piece of prestige TV that announced his talents to the world. That show warned of the ways that society might grow fragmented and open to exploitation the more it hinges on technology. Now Sam's back with another tale that highlights the dangers of digitalism, shining a light once again on how quickly our technology-dependent society might be dismantled with the click of a button with the right line of hacker code. The film stars Julia Roberts and Ethan Hawke as parents who escape to a Long Island vacation home, only for a stranger and his daughter, played by Mahershala Ali and Myha'la Herrold, to turn up unannounced in the middle of the night bearing tales of electrical blackouts in the city. It's a film that speaks very much to the anxieties of our time. In the years since Sam created Mr. Robot, we've seen Russia hack the 2016 election and Cambridge Analytica influence the Brexit vote here in the UK. We now live in an age where it is very possible for global superpowers to digitally disrupt the democracies of their rivals. So maybe the question isn't why Sam would go back to the themes of Mr. Robot. Perhaps the real question is, why wouldn't he? In the spoiler conversation that you're about to hear, which covers every important plot point from this great movie, Sam discusses the huge departures made from the Roman Alarm novel on which this story is based. We get into the severity in real life of a cyber attack of this magnitude, and of course break down why the TV show Friends has a massive part to play in Leave the World Behind, resulting in one of the best movie punchlines of 2023. A huge thanks to Sam for being such a fantastic guest, and a massive thank you also to our Patreon supporters. If you like what we do on Script Apart and want to see the show continue to grow, you can join our Patreon community today for the price of a single monthly cup of coffee. In return, you'll get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, and the chance to ask your questions to upcoming guests. Not a bad deal if you ask me. The address if you'd like to get involved is patreon.com/Script Apart. Okay, with that all out the way, let's get into it, shall we? This is the brilliant Sam Esmail discussing the first draft secrets of Leave the World Behind. A huge thanks for tuning in, everyone. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demet. Sam, it's great to meet you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Massive congratulations on Leave the World Behind. I had an absolute riot of a time with this film. You know, I've read you describe it as a story with no hero's journey and no moral, but I've got to say, the last shot of this film, Sam, I definitely took a moral from. Physical media is important, people. When the cyber apocalypse comes, you know, you're going to want those DVD box sets.
Well, then I stand corrected. You're absolutely right. If the moral of this movie is physical media roles, then I'll happily accept that.
Well, it really is such an accomplishment, Sam. And I realized on my second watch, kind of a singular movie as well. Like the disaster movie genre that this, I think, fits into, it has quite a long and storied history, but there really haven't been a huge number of disaster movies in which the disaster is digital. So, yeah, maybe let's begin there. Was that one of the things that drew you towards this tale, Sam? Like the opportunity to cover new ground and to add a new type of disaster to the disaster movie canon?
Yeah, in fact, I'd had that idea before I'd read the book that I wanted, because I'm such a fan of the disaster genre. So I wanted to do a disaster film centered around the cyber attack, because I feel like even though everyone sort of is aware of that term, it's ominous, but mystifying. I don't think people understand exactly what that might look or feel. I don't even know if I understood it. So it was something that I was curious about, and I thought would be a great foundation for a good disaster flick. And then I read the book, and I think what was great about the book were these like really fascinating characters that with their own sort of unconscious biases and their sort of disconnect from one another, they start to kind of crumble, and they kind of like parallel what's going on in the world around them. And I just thought, wow, what an interesting inversion of the disaster formula, because disaster films tend to, prioritize the spectacle, right? That tends to be front and center, and the characters tend to be secondary. Well, here in the book, you kind of found the opposite, that the characters were front and center, and the disaster elements were more in the distance, and that just felt more real to me and relatable, and in that way more terrifying. And so I combined that with this kind of cyber attack idea that had been in my head, and I just thought it overlaid this story that Ramon had written so beautifully, and away we went.
You mentioned there how we don't really understand what a cyber attack is, what it would look like, where it's to unfold. Can you tell me about some of your homework in this subject matter? I feel like Leave the World Behind feels like it's something that could plausibly happen. I'm hoping you're going to tell me that, no, that's not the case. It's completely fabricated.
No, well, look, the reason why I wanted to explore it was because it was a fear of mine, but I also didn't know exactly what that would look like. I'd over the years read articles warning us that this was going to be, I think as early as the early 2000s, Panetta had even said the next 9/11 would be a cyber war or cyber attack. So there had been a lot of theorizing about what it would look like, but until I decided to put pen to paper and say, okay, how am I going to dramatize this? I just found all this research, and everything in the film came from that research, because I really wanted to make it as grounded as possible in terms of what could potentially happen today. And what's interesting about it is you're not necessarily witnessing in the film, you're not necessarily witnessing a direct cataclysmic sort of event from the cyber attack itself. It's the sort of residual effects of the cyber attack. Like take, for example, the oil tanker that grounds on the beach. Well, that in and of itself is not necessarily killing people or causing some, disastrous thing to the infrastructure or anything like that. But if it kind of disarms us from fuel, well, what are the ripple effects of that? So it's these kind of reverberations of a cyber attack that was sort of weirdly more insidious than sort of a direct attack. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. You, of course, are no stranger to stories about how the more our world becomes reliant on technology, the less reliable it's rendered. When you finished Mr. Robot, did you know that you had unfinished business in that kind of thematic space?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think technology has exponentially developed over the last, I can say 20 years, but honestly, 5 years even. And it's had such a massive impact on society and how we interact with one another. And I feel like it's such a uniquely modern dilemma that has so many facets. In fact, if you watch Black Mirror, that's why they have so much mileage to tell such great stories, because there's so many different angles to sort of explore the impact or the effects that technology has on ourselves. But they're sort of doing the 5 minutes into the future version, whereas even like today, just the tech that we have today and what it's sort of and what its impact on society is today. I just think there's so many different angles, and for whatever reason, I've always gravitated to stories about that. And maybe it's because I don't see a lot of it in my TV or film diet. So it's one of those things that I've just always been drawn to.
Yeah. Well, we should talk for a minute, I suppose, Sam, about the real life events that this movie either dovetails with accidentally or is perhaps even in direct conversation with. Because, you sold this movie in July 2020, and it was after that you went away and wrote the screenplay. I'm not sure the exact chronology of when the movie was written and when it was that you went into production, but man, 2020 heading into 2021, when presumably you were grappling with this story, that was a time in which, collectively, we all got a real front row seat to just how precarious it all is, just how easily all things could collapse, between COVID and then January 6th. Were those sorts of real life events playing on your mind as you sat down to write? Do you think you channeled them either consciously or subconsciously?
I had read the book during the pandemic. It was like the early days of the pandemic. And this just shows how prescient Rahman was in writing the book, because he wrote the book prior to the pandemic, but it felt so connected to what was going on, because the theme of the book that really spoke to me was this idea of how easily we can lose sight of our common humanity in the face of a crisis. And that was so resonant. And I'm looking out into the world at the time and how we're reacting to the pandemic, where in a moment where we really needed to sort of come together and figure this out, we were doing the exact opposite. We were we were using it as a way to divide us and retreat into our own corners and our own echo chambers. And again, I just found that such a uniquely modern dilemma that I felt Rahman was scratching at something about how we have to navigate our modern world. And as relevant as it was when I read it then, it's equally relevant today with everything going on in the world. I feel like it keeps happening. And so I would say, yes, in general, it's not a specific news story, but it's sort of the way where humans are now expected to behave in the face of crises, is that we just end up pointing the fingers at one another. I just have never felt it so palpably before this time. And so of course that was part of, of course that influenced the writing and the making of the movie.
So, we spoke a moment ago about how this is a disaster movie. You've been looking for a disaster movie project for a while. Can you talk me through the ways in which, the movie kind of satisfies the demands of the genre while also kind of adding something new to the canon? Like we already spoke about how a cyber attack isn't something that we've seen in this genre before. You spoke about the balance between spectacle and character and wanting to upturn that. What else would you say is the film doing in its kind of in the dialogue that it shares with the disaster movie genre?
Well, I think tone is everything, right? And I think with this film, I wanted to be careful about not being derivative of the kind of music or sort of tropes that the disaster genre inherently has, and that's really just because when you're doing something that's suspenseful and you're creating tension, if the audience starts to be ahead of you, then it's kind of game over for you. The whole idea is that they, that they want to know what happens next, but they have no fucking clue what happens next. When you have them in that position, I think they're going to be on for a ride. And the way to achieve that really is by subverting their expectations with tone. And that's all created through ambiance, the set deck, the music, adding humor in moments where you don't expect it. And really, again, making it feel as lived in as possible. Because, like I said earlier, a disaster film really typically really uses the characters as simply as avatars for the spectacle. And here we're trying to invert that process where the characters are the spectacle. Their kind of interaction, their dynamic, and their kind of conflict that arises is the parallel to what's going on in the world around them. And that was so I would say in those ways it sort of breaks the formula of what you would typically see in a disaster film.
I want to get into some of the beats from the movie, but first, Sam, I hear you write very quickly, and that the kind of vomit draft for this film tumbled out of you in like 2 weeks or something.
Right.
Which is surprisingly quick, because like it's not like this film is a direct translation of the book into film form. You know, as we've been talking about, you were grafting your own fears and your own fascinations onto Roman's story. You were changing characters around. Ruth in the book is, of course, GH's wife, not his daughter.
Right.
Can you talk me through how you started to kind of map out all those changes and some of the rationale behind those choices?
Yeah, you know, I don't outline. I like, and this is part of the reason why I like a vomit draft. I like things to be like on the like kind of sort of on the edge of my mind, and I want it to just kind of bleed out and come out as fresh and as little interference from my brain to the computer, and so. So when I read the book, well, I first read the book as a fan because I just wanted to enjoy the book, which I loved very much. And then when I read it the second time, I immediately saw the changes that I would make, the cyber attack component, the Ruth component, and other little changes, you know, especially as it ends in the third act. I first brought up those changes to Roman, and once he signed off and kind of understood that, hey, this was just going to be sort of a recontextualization of the book, he was obviously getting his blessing was obviously paramount for me to do this. I kind of then went away, kind of didn't think about it for a while, and then later, a couple months later, when I was ready to write, I read the book again. I remembered all of those ideas. And usually that's like a test to me, right? If I can remember an idea 2 months later and didn't write anything down, that there's something to it. It's sticking in my mind that, you know, there's something about it that is speaking to me. So then I immediately, as fast as possible, get it down on paper. And look, the vomit draft is a terrible draft. It's not, let me just say that up front. It is not a good version of the script, but it's the freshest material in my head. It's got the kernels and gems that I'm looking for. And then from there, like in a kind of like imagine sculpting a piece of rock into something, then you start to chip away and you try and find the truth of the story from there. And that's sort of been my process. I guess I kind of consider the vomit draft a little bit like my outline draft.
Yeah. And I know you're a big Kubrick guy, and presumably his approach to adaptation, you know, the way that to him, books were always vessels for his preoccupations as a storyteller rather than stories to be adapted faithfully. It seems like that's something you either inherited from him or you just happen to share.
I didn't know that, but I completely agree with him. Yeah. I mean, look, if something's working so well in a literary medium, it would be really odd to think that would work as equally as well in a cinematic medium, with, you know, that without any changes. I mean, to do a 1-to-1 copy of that to me makes no sense. So I never subscribe to this idea that you have to be faithful to the source material, because it's working in that medium for a reason. And I think when you have to adapt something into another medium, first you have to find a compelling reason as to why you're adapting it, and usually that means because there are changes that you want to make that maybe can impact the story more or recontextualize the story more in that new medium. And so for me, it's all those changes that I saw in the book that I immediately said, oh, I see the movie here. But if I were just to see the movie as a Xerox of the book, I would probably say to myself, well, just read the book. You don't need to make a movie about it then, you know?
Yeah. Well, we're going to come back to Kubrick because there are a few Kubrickian flourishes to this film. This first draft, this vomit draft, was it roughly the same story? Were there different set pieces, different iterations of characters that you explored for a moment before you landed on the finished version of this film?
I would say that the set pieces were largely the same. I would say that the differences were in the dialogue and in the characterizations. That's where I feel like it was really rough and I needed to find my way through it. And usually I try and do that in multiple passes, because I had, 6 characters, well, really 7 with Danny, but 6 main characters throughout the film. I would kind of read the script and do a pass from one character's point of view, and just solely be in their head. And I would listen to the music they would listen to. I would kind of do a little backstory about them, and then I would kind of read it through their eyes, and then sort of do their work on their kind of arc and their dialogue in that way. And I would just kind of repeat that process as I ran through the whole movie from every point of view. Because, weirdly, and this is another great kind of staple of the disaster genre that I love, is that they're typically ensemble cast of characters, and it's kind of this affords you this sort of panoramic view of whatever the crisis is. And I love that. It's part of the reason why I changed Ruth from the wife to a daughter, because I really wanted that sort of Gen Z millennial point of view, especially given how sort of timely, this kind of disaster would be. It'd be weird not to have that kind of dimension into the cast of characters. So yeah, it's kind of a repetitive process, but I kind of want to get as close to each person's sort of mindset as possible before I start to work on their story arc.
You mentioned backstory there.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by that. Did you have mapped out for yourself, even if it's not going to appear in the film, backstories for the characters, yes, but also kind of a wider context for what's going on? Because, of course, in the film, it's sort of withheld from us. We kind of get snatches of answers, and there are things that we can guess towards as this is what's going down. Did you know that, or was that kind of not important to you? Because really it's about the characters and their experience of it. They don't know, so why should you as the author, I suppose?
Exactly. I would say that for me, it was more important to keep the integrity of the characters and their backstories as real and as human as possible. But when it came to the disaster elements, I wanted to be with the characters. And the more I know about who's behind it or what's causing it or what the motivation is, the more I think it would contaminate, the spirit of the movie, which is that we're really in the dark with these people.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's dive into some scenes. There's so much to discuss here. The film begins with this shot of Earth, Sam. And, of course, it's a big VFX shot. That costs money. So it's obviously not in there by accident. Same again with the shot later in the film of the American flag on the moon. Can you talk to me about why you chose to start the movie this way with that visual that kind of puts it all into perspective, how I suppose like small and meaningless the Earth is?
There you just said it. I was about to say exactly what you just said. I love the idea that that perspective is everything. Especially, again, I know I keep repeating myself, but in a disaster genre, you are thrust into the thick of the action. Typically, that's the ride that you signed up for. But here, the perspective is so about these people, and the disaster elements are off into the distance. And so for me, when I decided to open with the planet, I wanted to show the perspective of us in this sort of black oblivion, almost this black void, and that here we are, and it's just this blue dot in the middle of space, and this is all we have. And monumental things can happen to us, intimate things can happen to us, but regardless of what it is, we've got this one rock that we have to find a way to coexist on. And I thought that really kind of mapped out what the film is really about, which is ultimately it's something that's said between Amanda and Ruth in the shed later on, when Ruth says, I agree with everything you said about people, but we're all we've got. And I think that could be interpreted as really shitty, or that could be interpreted as optimistic and hopeful that we've got to figure out a way to coexist and come together. But yeah, I love just setting the table of the film with just a snapshot of our home,
And that leads us into this cold open with Amanda and Clay. Amanda has some really intriguing dialogue in this opening. Like, she's very restless, very agitated. She describes how it's been such a hellish year for us, as you know, and I just seemed to be working every day without realizing it, and you were constantly anxious about your job. She walks over to this window and begins to describe being awake at sunrise, observing all these people starting their day with such tenacity, such verve, all in an effort to make something of themselves. It kind of goes on like this. She says that she remembers what the world is actually like, and then she comes to a more accurate realization. I fucking hate people. I'm really intrigued by this opening because it doesn't feel like that feeling that Amanda's expressing is localized to her. There's quite a few characters in this film who are experiencing, before the disaster strikes, their status quo is one of dissatisfaction or some lack of fulfillment in their lives. Can you talk to me about why that was interesting to you, much more so than the idea of, this being like an idyllic family with an idyllic life and that being what's interrupted in this story?
Well, I wanted to start as early as possible in Amanda's arc, but really also begin the sort of the arc of the theme of the movie, which is that it's in the title. It's these characters are having this feeling that they want to run away. They want to run away from people. They want to leave the world behind. And that's the dramatic question that I want to set up that then we kind of poke and prod at throughout the rest of the film. And for me, what was interesting about her saying that line, I fucking hate people, is how many people might relate to that. And again, I think that's sort of a uniquely, maybe it's not so unique. I mean, maybe I'm just speaking out of turn here, but it feels very modern to have that sense that we're not as connected with our fellow humans as we maybe were before. And you could you can blame it on tech, you can sort of blame it on the sort of the effects of tech, but it's ultimately something that I feel is palpable right now. And so as much as I thought it worked for our characters and the story and the theme, I found it also kind of universal. It's kind of an anxiety that I think is out there right now that the film sort of triggers right away.
We then watched the family on their drive to the rental home, which again, I'm going to bring up Kubrick again, reminded me of The Shining.
Sure. Yeah.
Along the way, we get to meet Rose and Archie, who are Clay and Amanda's kids. You've described all the characters in Leave the World Behind as products of the modern world. I was wondering if you could unpack that phrase for me and how you wove that into this introduction to those characters, with Rose glued to her iPad and right. Archie, I think, playing some sort of video game.
Yeah, well, it's all in the car, right? You open on Amanda and she's on a call. You get to Clay, who's, listening to music. And then Archie playing a video game and Rose on the iPad. And I remembered when we did that shot and I'd watch it back, talk about something that's uniquely modern. That could not have happened at any other time. At any other time in The Shining or in Funny Games, they had to talk to one another. They couldn't just play a sophisticated video game. I guess you could in the 90s with a Game Boy, but outside of that, really not. You definitely couldn't watch a TV show. And if you go back in the 80s, you couldn't be on the phone. So this was just sort of setting up the template that our use of technology has divided us in such a way that a family going on vacation, just as innocuous as that, taking a road trip to this weekend getaway, are all in their separate universes. They're all in their separate bubbles, and it's normalized. It's not out of the ordinary. I think if you showed that image to someone 30 years ago, it would be extremely odd and strange. And I just found that to be a very interesting observation that I thought really set up the sort of theme of tech and our reliance on tech.
I should also mention, that there is nuance to your approach to tech in this story and in your larger body of work. There's a more positive side to what tech enables, the connections it can foster, that you definitely also find room for in your shows and in your movies. You're not just saying tech is bad. Can you talk to me about the kind of philosophy behind that and how you get the calibration right on the page? Like, when you do your first drafts, do you sometimes find yourself going too hard on tech and then kind of pulling back and having to add in that balance? Tell me how you find that nuance.
Well, it's weird because I just, as a person, I fundamentally believe that tech is just a tool. I don't think it's good or bad, you know what I mean, in and of itself. I know that from Mr. Robot and now this, people could maybe say that I'm a technophobe or that I find that tech to be the villain of our world. I don't know. It's how we use it. It's the human side of it that I'm more interested in. Is that why is it our instinct to use tech in this way, to seclude ourselves in these bubbles, or to use it to kind of divide one another, or to use it to instigate a war? You know, why are those? What is it about that? What is it about the human condition that makes us lean into that? And so in a weird way, when I did all that stuff about basically all the runner with Rose and that opening scene in the car, that was all in the vomit draft. And they're innocuous. These are innocuous moments. I didn't think I was overdoing it. I think that was pretty spot on to how families might look nowadays. I've seen it. I've witnessed it. And it's, again, I want to repeat, it's normal. I remember on my Instagram, and I don't really use Instagram much. In fact, I think I kind of basically stopped using it years ago. But I remember when I first started using it, I found it funny that when I would go out to dinner with friends, there would be moments we're literally at the dinner table and everyone's just on their phone. No one's talking to one another. Yeah, and I would just snap a picture and I would post it on my Instagram and I would say, you know, this is what dinner is like in 20 and we would go out to drinks and then the same thing would happen again. And this would just naturally occur. And it's unspoken and it's just kind of the way of the world. And I find it fascinating. Is this what we've always wanted to do? Was to check out and we just couldn't before because we didn't have phones? Or is this something driven by the fact that we can do it now? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I find it infinitely interesting.
What is also infinitely interesting is the house that we arrive at. I know it is such a cliche to, you know, talk of a space as a character.
Yeah.
That really does kind of feel true. Like,
absolutely.
If we talk about characters as these changing, evolving things, unless I'm going insane, the house itself is changing throughout the film. There are paintings on the walls that seem to be changing shape. Even the wallpaper seems to shift. Like, again, if you'll permit me one last Kubrick allusion, like it reminds me of the way in The Shining that, you know, there's this geography to the Overlook Hotel that's purposefully kind of confusing and distorted. And that just places this sense of unease in your subconscious as you watch. I'm not imagining this, right? This is a part of the film. Yeah,
look, the way I will answer that question is, well, twofold. You know, I've always, and this is from the writing and the plot beats, but also from the way we filmed it, is I wanted this film to feel like a nightmare that starts off as a dream and insidiously sort of starts to morph into something darker. And that, you know, I don't know if you've ever had a dream like that where it doesn't start off bad, but as it gets further and further down the road, it just starts to boil into this like nightmarish, you know, outcome. And I remember that's a feeling, and that kind of defies logic. And I remember knowing that, you know, when we went to make this movie, that was very integral to the tone of what I wanted to achieve. And so, you know, so the second part of my answer is that when and I do this with everything, but, you know, when you work on a scene with the cast, you know, there's your dialogue, there's your blocking, but, and you have that conversation, but then there's the conversation about subtext. It's all the things that are not being said. It's all the things that are not on the page. And that's mainly the actors' work. And we talk about it, and, you know, they can say a line, but the way they say it could completely change the context of that line. And so subtext is really important because that's how life really operates. And I do the same thing with my visuals. So when I speak to my production designer, there's the setting, there's the look of the house, there's what would they actually have, the sort of common day, appliances and furniture and that kind of thing. But then like with my cast, we then talk about subtext. Well, what is lurking underneath it? And so those conversations sort of lead to that thing that you're probably feeling throughout the film, and that conversation really started with this idea of this needs to feel like a dream that's turned into a nightmare, and when that happens, logic needs to be fungible.
And had you done something like that theoretically with the paintings, which we can neither confirm nor deny, would that normally come in at like a later point after the script is locked, or are you literally writing that on the page?
No, that's those kinds of conversations. Some of it was on the script, but mostly because I'm not a production designer and I don't pretend to be. That's something I lean on my production designer to come to me with ideas and have a conversation with her about before I would put it on the page.
Mm-hmm. The boat crash that we've already alluded to, that's the kind of first real announcement of something being awry here. It's interesting, though, for all those moments of big spectacle, like the plane crash later on in the film, I think the most unnerving moments in Leave the World Behind are kind of the animals, like first the deer, then the flamingos. There's kind of a brief explanation that we hear about, some sort of environmental disaster down south causing strange migration patterns or something like that. If that's the kind of narrative explanation of what we see in terms of those animals, what do you think they represent thematically to you?
I think they're a warning, on a very metaphorical level. And then this is how I interpreted the book and sort of what my intention behind it in the film was. Rose to me symbolizes, our youth, the future generation, and they're warning us that something about the planet, that we're not going to have a planet if we keep going the way we're going, and everyone ignores them, and we just kind of keep going along as if this won't happen, and we're ignoring the warning signs. And I remember on that kind of journey that Rose goes on, it was really important to me to sort of have her and that relationship with the animals, to have her symbolize that tension that we have with nature, especially given the fact that we are so embroiled with our tech that we're ignoring our kind of human side, because our human side is the natural world, and we're kind of moving away from that to go into this more man-made, artificial, technical side, and so in that way, in that metaphorical way, that to me is what the animals are representing. They're a flashing red light to say that there's caution ahead, and I think unfortunately most of the characters in the film ignore it, except for Rose.
GH and Ruth then turn up at the house, Sam, and Amanda is immediately full of suspicion towards them. That suspicion, the film makes apparent, is definitely rooted in unconscious bias, like in racism, essentially. And this is a really interesting kind of strand of the movie. The film seems to be exploring, in the backdrop of the disaster elements, something about what disaster turns us into. There are a few moments in the film early on in which, like, these characters, Amanda and Clay, who you suspect might normally regard themselves as probably quite progressive, they act towards people of colour in a less than hospitable way. So, as well as Amanda's microaggressions towards GH and Ruth in that scene, we get that moment in which Clay has that encounter in his car with the Spanish-speaking woman on the side of the road, who he just leaves in, her moment of panic. He does nothing to help her. Can you talk to me about, what you wanted to interrogate with those beats in the film? Because it feels quite pointed.
That scene in particular with Clay and the woman on the side of the road was in the book. And what I loved about that scene, and what I really wanted to capture, and again, this is just a microcosm of what I think all the characters are going through, is in the face of panic and in the face of crisis, who do you look out for? What do you do? And I think in that moment, yes, she's Hispanic. Clay can't understand her. And instead of finding a way to bridge the gap, finding a way to connect with her, he does the only thing he knows how to do, which is to protect himself, because he let the fear of the unknown, sort of take over. And honestly, that's just this microcosm of what I think the book and what we were trying to do with the film, we just expanded on a kind of, first on a level of these 6 characters in particular, but really on a societal level. Do we let our sort of differences feed into our fears, which then kind of divide us and then have us retreat into these corners? And if that happens, are we doomed then to sort of fail? I mean, I would argue yes. And so why is that? What is going on in that? Because I will say, in that scene, as uncomfortable as that is, it kind of puts you in the position as an audience member. What would you do? It invites that question. And I think a lot of people would be torn. I think a lot of people might have done what Clay did, and maybe a lot of people wouldn't, but that's the idea, is to provoke that conversation.
I think it's important as well that both Clay and Amanda have moments of reckoning with their behavior. I think Amanda kind of acknowledges to GH where she let herself down in terms of her response, and Clay has that moment with Ruth later on in the film where he kind of, in this kind of confessional way, talks to Ruth about that experience. That seems quite purposeful. Like, it's a generous reading of how sometimes in these kind of apocalyptic stories, the message is not particularly generous. It's one of humans are by design, by default, they're kind of fragmented and tribalistic. But the fact that they, both Clay and Amanda, kind of have these moments of reckoning suggests that that's not built in. It was these moments were kind of informed by panic.
Absolutely. And it's not as simple as humans are terrible and we're tribalists. I don't believe that. I think humans are messier. And I think particularly in sort of in modern life, I think there's a lot of confusion about how to behave and how to act because of the influence that tech and social media and everything else going on has on us. And it's causing us to fear and have panic. But in no way does that mean that we should paint all these characters with one brush and say, well, they're just terrible and they're just tribalistic. I think they can be terrible and they can be tribalistic, and they can feel guilty, and they can be warm to one another, and they can want to connect to one another. And they're all of these things, and they're complicated. And it's that to me is what feels more true to life.
Yeah. And not only does Amanda kind of reconcile with GH, but they share this moment together. I mean, first and foremost, I did not know that I needed to see Julia Roberts dancing to Too Close by Next, but I'm glad I now have that in my life. They then almost kind of share this embrace, this moment.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about what's happening in that scene?
And this is the thing that I think with disaster films or even thrillers in general, there tend to be moments like that don't really exist in those movies. And for me, what felt real is that in a moment of despair, especially if you think about GH's point of view there, he's all but accepted the fact that his wife is probably dead. I think in those moments is when we need a release, and we need to act silly, and we need to just distract and run away and not think about it. And I love that dance sequence because it's such a desperate moment for connection for the two of them. They just need to be held. And it's not, I never thought of that moment as a romantic moment. It's a yearning for feeling human with someone again. And I love that it happens in this like comical way because, you know, look, tragedy and comedy are very linked together for a reason. I think as humans, we need to laugh when we're uncomfortable. And so, yeah, I think that's where that scene came from. It's just a finding a way to get these two characters to sort of disarm one another and come together in more of a cathartic release rather than anything else, you know?
Yeah. Well, of course, everyone needs a bit of relief when your son's teeth are starting to fall out. I mean, the nightmarishness of that scene is one thing. It also kind of from a narrative perspective leads us towards the kind of Kevin Bacon character in the story. It leads us towards Danny, who's this character who is in a like ensemble cast of different perspectives. It's another different perspective. It's this hoarder kind of character who's been prepping for something like this for a few years and has this kind of paranoia that he carries with him. Can you tell me about that standoff in the film? It's pretty scary, and it introduces it introduces some new theories as to what's happening.
Well, yeah, look, I love the character of Danny because, I think I've seen and met people like that in my life. And again, could be a unique invention of our modern world. I don't know. I think a person who's so down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and that paranoid that they're kind of making their own kind of bunkers and their own safe houses is something pretty interesting. And the fear in writing a character like that was that he could be a caricature, you know, like and you know, casting Kevin Bacon, who somehow found a way to make this guy feel three-dimensional, because I certainly won't take credit for it because I don't think I found it on the page, but Kevin definitely in his performance found him to be a real person, and that really came from the place of Danny is doing this to protect his family, which is what GH is doing, which is what Clay is doing, which is what Amanda is doing. And so that whole standoff is about that. It's about people fighting for their families. And when we made the scene about that, it all of a sudden, I think Ethan and Mahershala and Kevin really found their North Star. And I personally think that scene works because you understand everyone's point of view. There's not like a mustache twirly villain in that scene. Everyone has a point. Everyone has a justifiable reason as to why they're doing what they're doing. And it's crazy when you watch a standoff and you can root for both sides. You know what I mean? There's no wrong answer there. I think that's a great place to put an audience member in.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about it is his theories, which are again informed by his paranoia as someone who probably is too far down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and has been for years. It adds to like this overwhelm of theories as to what's going on. Like at every juncture in the movie, you've got Ruth suggesting it's something to do with power plants, and there are different kind of suggestions at every turn for who's doing this and what exactly they are doing. Can you talk to me about like overwhelming the viewer with possibilities for what could be happening and then the decision to completely withhold?
Well, it's the part of the movie that I wanted to protect, because the ambiguity that happens in the film is completely intentional, because it is what happens in life. I didn't pull conspiracy theories out of my ass. This is something that people do naturally on a daily basis. They read into things, they question things, they come up with theories on why things are happening, even if it's innocuous. And sometimes they're right. I'm not going to say that every conspiracy theory is bullshit. There are times where we legitimately should question things, and there might be answers that really shock us. And so the ambiguity that the movie ends on really is meant to reflect how life sort of never gives us easy answers and solutions. I mean, the pandemic, for example, is something that I still don't wrap my head around on exactly how that happened, how it started, and I don't even know if there is a real answer or consensus on that right now. And we may never know. And that's something Kevin says in that scene. We may never know what's going on. That feeling is the most horrifying and terrifying. I think honestly, that's why conspiracy theories are on the rise, because there's so much to question and there's so much mystery in our world that conspiracy theories give us a sense of control, because we feel sort of helpless and lost without it. But that is sort of how we have to navigate the modern world right now. So I love that line that Kevin says, that Danny says at the end, where he says, we may never know. I think, honestly, the movie ends on that note. There's a million different explanations. GH gives one in the car that seems pretty backed up in fact, but the movie still it doesn't pull punches. It doesn't kind of pull out and say, yes, GH was right. It lets it linger and leaves it up to you to sort of decide on your interpretation of what's going on.
One thing that's floated that does feel true, that feels in fact true to real life, is when GH gives that speech about kind of reading the curve, and he tells that story to Amanda about his very rich client, who we'd definitely recognize the name of. That whole element of like the rich, the wealthy, the elite getting a heads up in a situation like this, and also that line in there about the sort of terror of no one being in control, those feel incredibly resonant to our world today. Can you tell me about writing that scene?
Honestly, that was weirdly a reaction to sort of the way Mr. Robot was received, because I would say Elliot in that show definitely believed there is like this cabal of people who are pulling the strings, and a lot of people came away from the show thinking, yeah, that's what's happening in our world. And I personally, if that were true, I think actually I'd feel better, because then, okay, we know that 10 or 20 rich assholes maybe are in control. At least someone's in control, and if we appeal to them, we can fix everything. But to me, my strong belief is that no such cabal exists. No one's in control, and that's even fucking scarier. And how do we reconcile with that? That's the kind of tug of war the film goes back and forth on. Is are we in control? Can we get out of this? No, it's like that scene on the beach. They see the ship coming towards them. They see the oil tanker. Rose keeps mentioning it. No one seems to care. Then at the very last minute, it's really up and close, and they're still kind of questioning, well, it's going to stop, right? And then eventually they're like, okay, we're going to get up and go. And that's the thing. It's how we really want to feel that we're in control. We really want to feel other people are in control of whatever else is going on in the world. But the truth of the matter is, there isn't any sort of singular body of people that can help us out of this, and that we have to figure out a way to just get up ourselves and kind of figure it out for ourselves. And that's the sort of tug of war I think that the characters go throughout the story.
They absolutely do, because one thing that's interesting that again subverts what we expect from a disaster movie is typically in these films, we have like the disaster happens, and it happens in the opening act. And then the characters take charge of their situation, and they find kind of ways to exert their agency on the situation and find refuge or make their situation better. In this movie, every single thing they try and do to kind of better their situation is completely futile. Like Clay going for a drive, he just ends up back at the house with nothing achieved. GH trying to go find that satellite phone, it doesn't work. And more to the point, it exposes the ridiculousness of when there's a problem with technology that's disrupted society, our only answer is to kind of reach for more technology. Right. Was that kind of a purposeful thing? Did you want to turn that on its head that way?
Oh yeah, for sure. Like Clay, just to piggyback on that, Clay wanting to just to go to a store to pick up a newspaper or talk to someone, he fucking can't do it because the GPS isn't working. Now, listen, a GPS, this is why I always say this film is like exploring uniquely modern issues, because we used to be able to drive around without a GPS, not that long ago. I mean, when I was in high school, I didn't have a GPS. I had to know my way around town, you know?
I've been to this hotel and done interviews here for like 10 years and I was still using Google Maps to get here. So I'm with you.
Yeah. And so to me, it is that, well, without tech, we feel lost, but then we reach out for more tech to help us. And it's that grasp and that reach and that sort of, okay, once that's all gone, then what do you do? And what do our characters do? They retreat and they feel, like Clay says at the end of the film, he feels like a useless man without his GPS and cell phone. And I think ultimately that's the conclusion of that, is that how many people can agree with Clay in that line? I mean, I know I can. I feel helpless without my technology. So what happens? What happens when it's gone away? What happens when it's stripped away? What are we left with? And what does that say about our over-reliance on technology? Because the technology is growing in an exponential way. And alongside that, our reliance is growing. And we're going to reach a breaking point, and we have to kind of decide how we want to use tech in our favor rather than being our crutch.
Getting towards the end of the film, how did you work out the kind of way to deliver something satisfying in terms of, for some reason, after a film in which there's so much uncertainty, there's almost a relief in the certainty of seeing the disaster in front of us. When we have that shot with the camera panning up and we get to see what I believe is New York, completely ablaze. It's so powerful, and it is like weirdly like a release after so much pent up, fear. Can you talk to me about like finding that scene and how you approached it?
I wanted to put a point on, or I should say a period on the disaster, on the evolution of the disaster, I guess. Like we saw these glimpses of these different events, and it needed to build to a climax, and that was the climax. That is honestly for these characters. They are now seeing probably the biggest city in the country, like you said, ablaze. It's confirmed that we've crossed the Rubicon here. The point of that shot was to say, this is the point of no return. Right? Life is not going to go back to normal. This movie is not going to end where they've conquered the disaster and life returns back to the way it was in the beginning of the movie. So it was meant to kind of, and it does in that, we even visually did that, where the camera just kind of glides over it and says, we are now moving to a post-apocalyptic world right now, as we enter the Thorne's house and meet up with Rose. So as that was like a sort of period at the end of the sort of disaster storyline of the film, we then sort of enter the Thorne's house, where the movie then kind of ends more on a question mark of, okay, where do we go from here? What do we do about this, or how do we feel about this? And that was really that scene is obviously, that was not in the book, the bunker scene that I'm talking about when Rose goes down in the bunker, but the spirit of the way the book ended, it was literally a question mark, and it's something that I loved about the book, that it was so open-ended, and that it let, my favorite movie going experiences is when I leave a movie and I want to go to a coffee shop to talk about it for 2 hours with my friends, because there's so much interpretation, so much left for interpretation, and you can debate and have these and see these different ideas and different points of views, and people can call out the things that you missed, and you can share the things that you saw that they may have not seen, and then you can just have kind of a conversation about how it relates to the world and how it relates to us. When a question mark at the end allows you to do that, when you answer everything and you give a solution and the characters overcome it, movies end like that all the time, and I enjoy those movies. But I feel like it closes the door on conversation. I feel like you get out of that movie and you kind of forget about it, a couple hours later or whatever. And there's not much to talk about because the movie's given you all the answers. So in a weird way, the way we ended it was something really exciting, but really all at the same time really scary, because I know certain audience members are going to see that and be really fucking pissed off. And I think they're also, weirdly, I think, because I've been asked this before, I think they think it was intentional. Like I wanted to fuck with them. And it's not that, just anybody listening to this right now, in all earnestness, I did not want to fuck with you. That wasn't the intent. It was really meant to say, it's turning the story over to you and say, now you finish it. You tell me what happens next. What is your interpretation? What's your takeaway? And to have that conversation, which is something that I think great movies can do. It
ends on a question mark, but also a punchline. And one of the funniest punchlines I've seen in a film for a long time. Can you talk me through the evolution of this Friends joke?
For me, it's so multi-layered. Look, I came up with it because Rose's journey was really about these sort of parasocial relationships she has with these fictional characters, which I thought was so sweet and endearing. And, again, pretty universal. What do we do in moments of crises? I mean, at the time during the pandemic, we all watched Tiger King and talked about that, this like kind of ridiculous reality show or, docuseries that we all found comfort in when we were scared for our lives and scared for the lives of our loved ones. We watched this ridiculous show because we needed to find a community in something. We needed something that we could all agree on. And for Rose, I love that she had this really sweet yearning for these characters, not necessarily because she wanted to know how it ended, but because, and she says it's to Archie in the bedroom scene, because she hopes that they turn out okay. She actually cares about them as if they're people. Now, to me, that's really sweet. That's really endearing. But is that also incredibly dysfunctional, that she feels so detached and disconnected from her own family that she'd rather find out what happens with these fictional characters than she would? I mean, she hears she potentially heard her mom call out her name, but she chooses to go down to this bunker anyway, and she chooses to just play friends anyway. So there's that side of it. There's also a line that Ruth says earlier about how Friends is nostalgic for a time that never existed. Yeah. Which I, for me, was meant to say, yes, we can escape to our comfort food. We can escape to these shows. But we have to be, to some extent, a lot of people take those shows and say, oh man, it was so much better back then. Well, that's not really what reality was back then. That was their version of reality. And are we mixing our memories and our fantasy, and our fantasies together? And so it was like this sort of, it was sort of this like multi-layered thing. But the emotional through line was really about this escape, that after all this bleakness and all this uncertainty, the one thing we do know, the one thing that we can have an ending to that will answer all our questions is the series finale of Friends.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Sam, thank you so much for your time today. We're out of time, unfortunately. I've got to let you go. But let me just say this. Congratulations again on Leave the World Behind. It really is such a fantastic film. And appreciate you coming on Script Apart.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.